Yeah. So, and we can, as interactive as we can make it, the better, right? So, and I'm going to talk about this from a biological point of view, right? Like the neuroarchitecture, and that can inform the decisions, but it's not, I'm not going to talk about it from a Monty perspective specifically. But I think it might be helpful for people to see, or at least understand some of the concepts if they're not obvious, or you haven't been exposed to them before. So again, I'm not sure where everyone's mindset is about this on hierarchy. What you know, so let me just, I can just jump right into it. And I'm just going to do this verbally and just interrupt me if you have any questions. Really, that would be much better than me just talking. So when we talk about hierarchy in the neocortex, this comes about from two basic techniques that they use. Or two basic endeavors. One is anatomical evidence. Like this is how neurons are connected. So they look at what connects to what, the physical structure of the brain, and those connections sort of define a hierarchy. The other way they look at it is from a physiological point of view, like how do the cells respond? You show an image or a sound or something like that, and then you can look at different cells in the brain and you can see like, oh, they're not responding the same way. And so these, and how they respond and to what kind of responses they make is also evidence of hierarchy. So these two things working together, anatomy and physiology, are the basic means by which we understand the hierarchical structure of the cortex. There are very, very few theories about how this actually works in any detail. And I think we have some of the best. But there's a lot of data, huge amounts of empirical data on anatomy and physiology. And I've said this many times, you would be blown away by how many papers and the details of them and how hard they are to read. But there's so much data. So maybe we can just start off with, like, I think the whole idea of hierarchy really got kicked into gear with this famous 1992 paper by Thalamic and Van Essen, and we talk about it a lot. And so maybe I could just show you that paper, unless there's any questions before I get into that. Okay, I need to share my screen then. I'm going to do that by hitting the little share screen button.
I just want to maybe add something to what you said. First of all, echo how difficult it is to really understand hierarchy in depth, but it's also, in parallel, it's surprising to me that how many people have a very sort of narrow view of hierarchy in the literature. And the all thing is this one thing. A lot of it's from this Thalamic and Van Essen paper and onwards, and they just don't consider all of the other evidence that's out there. It's quite remarkable to me.
Right.
And how much, and like almost no one seems to understand like these few really important things about it that are like 90% of people don't consider.
Yeah.
Also feel like just from like a computational viewpoint, I feel like this whole idea of hierarchy for object recognition and a lot of work from like Jim DiCarlo and that whole group is again very dominant, and it's so focused on just recognizing objects. And so all it kind of results in is basically you have like, okay, cat versus dog. And that's kind of the extent of your representation and how rich or rather not rich it is. And there's just very little thought about like, okay, well, how do you kind of know what the dog looks like and any other kind of richer understanding about what a dog is? And it's like, no, you separate them in a high dimensional space, and then that's what hierarchy is for.
And part of the thing, I mean, you know, he and others also have lots of actual data, empirical data. So any other view has to be somewhat compatible with that data. Right. It has to also explain that. So
if you haven't seen it, this is this paper. The Thalamic and Van Essen paper is very famous. It's quite long, has a lot of data in it. What they basically did is they took a whole bunch of studies, mostly about the macaque monkey, and these were anatomical studies primarily, meaning they could, for example, inject a dye in one part of the neocortex, and that dye would then tell you where that part of the neocortex projects. That would be an antegrade dye, or retrograde dye, I mean, it would tell you what parts of the cortex project to it. And there's lots of ways of doing this. There's many different techniques. I'm not going to go through them. And so the data that this paper is built on is different they're all monkeys, but they're different ages of monkeys, different techniques, different preparations, different methods. So they're trying to really wrestle a whole bunch of stuff together. This is like a picture of a monkey's neocortex flattened out. This is what it looks like in the macaque monkey. And these things are all different regions in the cortex. And again, these are not obvious. If you look at the cortex, you don't see any of this stuff. They only determine this through various anatomical and physiological techniques to say, oh, there's actually, you know, this is the V1, this was the vision goes, and so on. So anyway, there's all these regions that they've kind of determined. And then they asked, well, how do we determine how they're connected together? So then there's all this data about studies about it, which we're not going to go into. But here's the basic technique. Here, these are all sort of very cartoon images of a little piece of cortex. And they're showing, and the cortex is showing upper layers, middle layers, and lower layers. And they're basically saying, well, if I look at two regions, I see how they're connected. Which cells in one region connect to what cells in another region, and it's different, right? It's not all the same, and so this asymmetry defines what is going up the hierarchy and going down the hierarchy. So this is how they built their map. So here's some cells in the middle layers of this region. They say, well, they project forward. They project to lower and upper regions. Then here's some other cells in another region that project. These are in the upper and lower regions, and they project differently than these connections are not all identical. So they're able to say, okay, a certain set of connections we're going to call ascending, meaning that they're going forward in processing. There's some connections which seem lateral, meaning they don't seem to be forward or backwards. And in this case, the regions that are projecting to each other, it's not obvious here, but the regions that are projecting each other, the same cells project to the same cells. So there's no asymmetry to the way they're projecting. And then there's some of these connections between regions are descending. And they'll say, because they just have a different connectivity profile than the ascending ones and the lateral ones. And it's really difficult to do this. It's a very difficult study for them to do, but this is a basic method by which they said if something hierarchically higher or lower than another region is through these types of connections. Because you could say, oh, V1 and V2 are connected together in both directions, but the projections from V1 to V2, which would be considered ascending, look different than the projections from V2 to V1, which would be descending. And then there's some other regions where the projections are similar both ways, and then we'd call those lateral projections. So that's the basic method. Is there any questions about that? Okay, we'll go on. And then the conclusion of all this, just jump down the bottom. These are all the studies that they used in the data. They ended up with this very famous diagram. Let me make this a little smaller so you can see it. And this is just the visual parts of the monkey. And you can start down here. This is at the very bottom. Here's the retina. These are retinal ganglion cells. And then this is the LGN, which is the thalamus, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then it goes to essentially the V1, the V2, and so on. And now, so the point of this diagram, and there's a lot of, this is not a very good picture because there's a lot of these boxes are just white. I don't know why that is. So there's LIP and 7A. So there's several dozen in here. And so they basically tried to figure out which ones are hierarchically above, which ones are hierarchically below. And so they have different layers of the hierarchy. This layer here, if you can see my cursor, then another layer here, and another layer here, and so on. And at the very top, they show this projecting to the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, which is where the people study the grid cells and you know, the momentary memory. And as we pointed out many times before, this is just a wiring diagram, and there's a lot of surprising things about it. First of all, how connected it is. How many regions connect to how many other regions? It's this incredible number. You know, it's not like a simple flow chart, right? And there's a lot of things at the same level that connect to each other or don't connect to each other, but they're still at the same level. And so there's something like 40% of all the connectivity between regions exists in this picture, which is kind of complicated. And it just doesn't look like a strict hierarchy in any sense, a very simple sense of the word. Information is flowing all over the place. So this idea that this information is processed step by step through a series of regions. Well, that is true if you just look at the series of regions that are step by step like this, but they're also skipping around. You know, V1 doesn't just project to V2, V1, you can see over here, V1 also projects to V4 and projects to, you know, this thing here and MT and so on. They'll go all over the place. So I never quite believed the idea that there's sort of a hierarchical processing that's in a strict form that people talk about. It's much messier than that. And so you have to understand clearly different animals have different sets of regions and their different arrangements, and it all seems to work. So, you know, and if you drop out one of these regions, you damage it. Well, the animal might have some deficit, but the whole system doesn't fall apart either. You know, they still continue to do various things. But this was just like, oh, look, it's a hierarchy. It's like a flow chart. And this became sort of dogma about it. And now
it's a little interesting because even in their abstract, they state that something like 40% of all possible connections actually exist, which, you know, really contradicts again this idea of this strict feed forward.
Right. And as Niels pointed out, I think it was Niels, that, you know, it's like so often this is done in vision. This is all visual regions in the monkey, and a lot of the physiology is vision, and we can talk about that. But that's really, and so it's been built around each other. And when you think about vision, they rarely even think about motor behavior at all. So this entire analysis of this, there's nothing about motor behavior here whatsoever. You know, most of these studies were done early on with anesthetized animals who aren't even able to move their eyes or think, and they show them various sorts of, you know, abstract patterns that aren't meaningful to the animal, even if the animal was alive, and then try to figure out how the cells are responding in these different regions. Now it's gone a lot beyond that since then, but there's this long history of like, yeah, how do we recognize an image? You know, there's an image of a dog, there's an image of a cat, and not like real vision where your eyes are moving and you're moving around the world and so on. So let's just, if we want, we can now contrast this to sort of the opposing or an alternate view of this, unless there's more questions about this. If this is not interesting, let me know, because I don't know if you all know this. So no one's going to want to speak up and tell me that, but you could. So we've been fans of these two scientists, Murray Sherman and Ray Guillory. Ray Guillory died recently, a few years ago, so he's no longer with us. But they, for many years, have been promoting two big ideas about cortical organization that are sort of missing from the Sherman, from the Feldman and Vanessa idea. And speaking personally to Murray Sherman, he found it very frustrating that his ideas were never really adopted by a lot of people. A lot of people know them, but they didn't become mainstream. But it's very clear to me these guys are onto the right thing. So let's just jump down here, jump to a picture. This is a picture that we've used, or we've used variations of this. And it's still about hierarchy, but it's a slightly alternate view of the hierarchy. So Sherman and Guillory don't say there isn't a hierarchy, but it's different. There's two major differences in what they propose. And so up at the top of this diagram, you have three blue boxes. Those represent cortical regions, if you will, like V1, V2, V4, that kind of thing. And what they're showing, some of this is showing the classic view. So the classic view, if this was the vision system, from the periphery, that would mean from the retina. And it goes, and the optic nerve goes from the retina. It goes through this thalamus, this what's called the VGN, ventral nucleus. And these are called relay cells. And then it projects up to the first cortical region, which would be V1. And then the classic view we saw from Bell and Vanessa is that they say V1 now would project to the next blue region, which would project to the next blue region, which projects to the next blue region, and so on. So that's how Feldman and Vanessa showed it. And they showed the thalamus as coming from the retina. I pointed it out, that coming from the retina, it goes to the thalamus, to these relay cells, which people say really don't do anything, but we know what they do. We know they do something a lot. And then it's all processed up here. So the first thing that Sherman and Guillory argued was that there's an alternate pathway between these regions of the cortex. And they argue this pathway exists everywhere. And that's shown here in more pink circles. These are other regions of the thalamus. This is standing first order, this is high order. So these regions of the thalamus also have relay cells, just like this first order relay, like here. They look very similar, but they don't get direct input from the eye. Instead, what they do is they get input from a cortical region. So here you see, they show a cell in layer 5, which projects down here, goes to this thalamic relay cell, which then comes up here and projects here. And this region also has a layer 5 cell. It projects down here to another thalamic relay cell and projects up here to the next cortical region. So this is an indirect pathway. It's instead of from cortex to cortex, cortical, it's cortical thalamic cortical, thalamic cortical. But these high order relay cells look very much like the first order relay cells here. And so they've argued that not only is this an alternate pathway, they've made many arguments. This is the dominant pathway. This is the most important pathway. The most important pathway is not the ones that go directly from cortex to cortex, but the ones that go from cortex to thalamus to cortex. These cells are bigger. The role you see here, when it comes from the retina, and it projects to the layer 4, that's similar to how it comes through this high order relay in projection to this region. So this is the number one thing they proposed, that there is at least another alternate pathway in the cortex defining the hierarchy that was not even mentioned in the Thalamic paper. And they've made all kinds of arguments why this is actually more important than the direct cortical. And I think I understand why, what's going on here. I didn't for a long time, but I think I understand why. And I've been arguing about this recently. I'm working on it, writing it up. But the idea that if there's a coordinate transform, or specifically an orientation transform, let's say you have an input that's coming from the retina, it's either a movement vector or it's a sensed pattern, you have to rotate it to match the object in the cortex. And so the cortex itself tells, this region of the cortex tells it what transform to do. Now the output of this region is going to go into another region, and this region has to do the same thing. Whatever the output of this region, and it goes back through here and says, look, I have to transform the orientation of this object to this sub-object, this my input, I have to transform it to, if there's like an edge coming from the eye, and now we have like the rim of the cup, well, now we have the rim of the cup has to be oriented to the body of the cup, something like that. So this is the first thing they proposed, that there's this alternate pathway, which is the major pathway, and exists everywhere in the cortex, and we should be thinking about that as defining the hierarchy. And in this case, this is why it's essential to understand what the thalamus is doing, because it's part of the hierarchical structure of the cortex. It is not an added thing on the side. And so in my world, our world, we would look at the following. You say, well, one of the things that's going on with the cortical projections could be voting. If these guys were all looking at the same object, it turns out that they're not doing sub-objects, they're looking at the same objects and pursuing the same object. You want to be able to vote on them, which is something important. But if there was a hierarchical structure to it, like this is looking at a letter and this is looking at a word, then you would want to be able to run through this pathway and basically encode handle the orientation difference between these two sub-objects and parent objects. I know that's a lot to try to absorb at once, but that's unless there's question, I'll go on to the second thing that they talked about.
Do people understand what Jeff just said?
Yeah, so when you say that with the hierarchical connection, it should probably go through the thalamic connection. Could it be that the cortical connection still transmits like feature information, and then only the pose information goes through the?
It's yeah, it could be. It could be. In fact, I think that's, well, I don't know. I mean, the pose has to, you have to change the feature to match the pose. Like if I'm building a model in these blue boxes, I have to take the current pose of the feature and turn it, at least I said the orientation of the feature, and put it into the form of the object itself. Well, I think it's a good question, Vivian. We don't really know. I think this is where theory can really help us, right? We're not going to get answers to questions like that from the neuroscience literature. I think where we can get answers to questions like that is we define very clear problems that we know the cortex has to solve. like hierarchical modeling and or compositional structure, and then say, okay, what are the absolute requirements to do that, and where could those things occur? So it's a good question, and I think theory can help us answer that question.
When you say proposals, include scale in there, or?
Well, no one will talk about any of those things in this literature. So if that's a question for Vivian, yeah, it's a question for Vivian. I think scale is handled differently, but maybe other people different. Again, I was just trying to talk about the neuroscience here today. I think some of these questions we can address independently of the neuroscience, or dipping back into the neuroscience. And so when I say like, oh, I think the thalamus could be doing this, it couldn't be doing this, you might have a better image in your mind of what I'm talking about.
One of the arguments they make is that this pathway from the relay cell into cortex layer 4 is much stronger than the cortical pathway, right? And
yeah.
So if what you're saying is true, we have to have a model that says feature information is not quite as, can be more like context, or weaker than the actual pose information.
It's kind of already happens.
It's kind of like that, like right now in the matching, we can recognize the morphology independent, kind of independent of the feature. Like features can just add evidence, but pose
As in
can
like
add
color,
subtract.
like color just adds evidence, but it doesn't subtract evidence. So its morphology is crucial.
Okay, well, that's a good insight.
Yeah, another question I would have is that here they make the distinction between first order and higher order thalamus. Is there like a distinction also in the functionality there?
Well, if you look at the anatomy and the physiology of the cells, there isn't a distinction. That it's very, very similar. Of course, what the cells respond to is different, right? By the way, this same organization exists for somatosensory or touch and hearing. And so obviously there's a lot of thalamic relay centers, a lot of those high order centers, and the cells in them are going to respond to different types of sensory input, or different, and the higher up you get, the more conceptual or the more object-like type of responses you get in these cells. So they won't have the exact same cell responses, but they're doing the same thing. Basically, it's hard to imagine that these high order relay centers are not performing the same function, just on different data.
Yeah.
How sorry.
No, go.
I was just say, is there evidence on like kind of how localized the projections are? Because I guess the thalamus is a fairly small structure compared to the cortex, and so if you have all these relay cells, like how, for example, presumably you don't have enough of them to have a one-to-one mapping. And so is there a possibility that these connections are more kind of coarse, broad spectrum influence, and the more fine grained?
It's actually just the opposite.
Okay.
The projections to the thalamus and the projections back from the thalamus are very constrained.
Yeah.
Meaning they don't spread broadly at all. And that's why they're called relay cells. Literally, it looks as if, imagine this is the optic nerve, this green line here. You can see my cursor, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? There's about 1 million fibers on the optic nerve. And there's about 1 million relay cells leaving the thalamus. And it looks, literally, it looks as if a single spike coming on one of these axons from the eye produces a spike on one of the relay cells leaving. So it's just getting to your point a little bit. That actually, these are constrained numbers. You may think 1 million is a lot, but there's a lot more cells up here. And in fact, this connection here, you see this connection from layer 6 back to the thalamus?
Yeah.
That's about 10 million cells. And in this particular, well, it's 10 to 1. It's roughly about 10 to 1. And this is more diffuse. This is some sense like this is encoding some sort of more complex signal, which I'm arguing is like a pose signal, where this is really just almost like it's just relaying it right through. Now, the numbers work out so that even though the thalamic relay centers are small, they're plenty large enough to handle all the cells that are projecting to them from layer 5. So it's literally every one of these layer 5 cells. There's two types, but the ones we're talking about here project down to a relay cell here, and then that projects up here to the next one, and so on. So these are very precise connections. It's not like a diffuse thing. It's not, and you don't see any mixing. You don't see the first order thalamus projecting over here or anything like that. Now, it gets wonkier than this. So even though I just said there's like a 1-to-1 correspondence going through, if you actually look at the cells from the retina, and this is, again, I checked this weekend. This is true for other sensory modalities as well. It's true for touch and vision, touch and hearing. There seems to be a single cell which responds, that relay cell. But this axon doesn't make connections to just one relay cell. It makes connections to a bunch of them. Not a huge number. I didn't get
I think it's like 20, it's like 15 to 30, somewhere in that range.
Right.
Yeah.
And the connections that are made from a single axon coming in here to these 20 or 30 relay cells, the connections look identical. That is, there's a special type of synapse. It looks very unique. It's as if this thing is connecting to 20 relay cells, but only one relay cell is doing anything, and the others are silent. But clearly the connection is there for them to affect those others. And I found a paper on that, what the hell's going on here, right? So yeah, it's doing a relay function, but somehow it seems like it could be doing it to any 20 or 30 cells. And we, Subutai, myself, and this researcher, Harmon, I forget her last name. What's her last name? Carmen. Varela, yeah. We kind of concluded that each of these cells could be like a multiplexer. That is, the signal coming back from the cortex could tell which relay cell this input is supposed to be routed to. It's like one gets active. And of course, when you do studies with anesthetized animals, that'll never change. It'll only be one, and the other connections will be inactive. But it looks like the other connections could be inactive. So we propose that this is doing a routing. It's taking these inputs and able to route them to different outputs, which is essentially would be what you would need to, you could map a pattern to another pattern, which was something you could do with an orientation change. So that's, I don't know if I got to your question, Neil.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks. Because that helps when thinking about what the potential functionality is. If it is relatively precise, then yeah.
And Subutai pointed, these are very strong. These are very thick axons. They make big, important synapses on the layer 4 cells where they project, and the other cells they project. They are, whereas these other direct cortical, the cortical connections, they seem weaker. There's a lot of them, but they're clearly encoding some spatial code, like a sparse distributed representation, where these guys, Sherman and Guillory call them drivers. They go like, these axons are pretty strong. They're going to make cells fire here. These connections between cortical regions directly don't seem strong enough to make things fire. They're weaker. So that would be perfect for our kind of voting mechanism, or any kind of prediction where you're depolarizing cells. So their argument, this is the strong thing. Now another thing is, if you believe in the canonical circuit from Vernon Mountcastle, like all cortical columns are the same, then this makes, Sherman and Guillory's view makes a hell of a lot of sense. That the cortex, you have a regional cortex and dissociated thalamic relay cells, that is the unit. And if you're going to do it on the first input to the brain, why wouldn't you do it on the next input and the next input and the next input? So this is the actual cortical column, in some sense, would incorporate both of these things as part of its circuitry. And now you have a parallel architecture all the way around, everywhere in the cortex. Everywhere in the cortex, it looks like this. And I'm not, as Sherman told me personally, he said, well, we haven't looked everywhere, but everywhere we've looked, this is what it looks like. So now the other big thing here, which is really puzzling at first, or maybe still is puzzling, but I think I understand it better now. These cells in layer 5 that do this feed forward here, they split. You see the split right here. They divide in two, and the other half of it goes down and it generates some motor behavior. So what does that mean? Like these in the visual system, this would be the part of the old brain called the superior colliculus, which is what actually moves the eye. So, and the other parts of the cortex, they always predict to something else that would move, that would change the input to this region. So in some sense, each cortical region has a motor output, which changes what it gets.
Are
Which is essentially-
those two separate neuron populations? Like, is it the same signal that goes to the thalamus as goes to the neural region?
Exactly the same. It's the same cells. Imagine this dot is one cell. It has an axon. The axon splits into two parts. One
Yeah.
part goes here and one part goes here. So it is the exact same signal.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah, some
Let's not
people
get
call it
worried
like a corollary discharge or efference copy, with
Yeah,
those terms. It's
yeah.
like literally a copy.
Okay.
yeah. Now, one way to think about this is when I think about now, I'm arguing recently when the eye is sending information to the cortex, it's sending two types of signals. It's sending the pattern that it's seeing, like a patch of the retina, but it's also sending a signal representing how the retina is moving. That's detected by the retina. And so there are two things passing through here. And they're separated. I could show you pictures of this. There's multiple sets of relay cells associated with this first order relay, and some of them are representing parts of the retina which are detecting motion, and some are representing parts that are detecting, sense features. So both motion and features are going through this, and I believe both motion and features have to be converted to the proper orientation so that you know how it's moving relative to the object. So now if I understand that there's a motion signal going through the thalamus here, well then that same thing is going to happen here. If this region is outputting, you don't think of this as just like it's a motor output. It's going back and it has to tell the next region up. Here's how I'm planning on moving the world. I'm trying to plan how I'm planning on moving the retina, or it's moving. This is the motion signal, and I need to tell the next guy up, like this guy says I'm moving the retina to the left by 4 degrees. Let's say it has to tell the motor system to do that, and it also can tell the next guy up, like, hey, I'm letting you know that I'm about to move the motor system by 4 degrees. Okay, there's something else going on which is not shown in this picture. I apologize how complicated this is. This is the part of the brain that's moving the eye, right? And notice it gets direct input from the eyes themselves. So when the eye, literally the ganglion cell, the axon from the cell in your retina, it splits here. One goes up to the thalamus, whether it's representing sensation or movement, it doesn't matter. And the other split goes over here. And so what's going on here is that this is the thing that actually moves the eye. This is the cells in here make the eyes spot or move or flow or whatever. And so it's possible that the input from the eyes themselves can make your eyes move. And if there's a little flash of light in the corner of your eyes will automatically switch over to that. You don't have to think about it. You can't. It just happens. And so there's this motor system going on. And now what's not shown in this picture is that the cells that actually generate the motor behavior here also come out, split, like they show it right here. You see the split right here, and they show it going up here, but it happens everywhere. So it actually would come out. This is the actual motor behavior that's being generated. This is the actual behavior. This is like a request for behavior. This is the actual behavior. These split and they go to each of these thalamic relay cells. So if I were to look at what's coming into the thalamus here, the LGN, the first order thalamus for vision, I've got two types of signals from the eye. I've got what's sensed and how the eye is moving, detected by the sensor. But I also get the efference copy directly from the superior colliculus, which comes over here and also goes to this thalamus. So there's two sources of movement behavior. One is coming from what's detected by the eye, like the eye says, I'm moving. Here's, the things are flowing across the retina. This one says, I'm about to move the eye. I'm sending a command to move the eye. You're going to get that earlier than the actual detection of the movement. but these are all segregated and kept separate as they move through the thalamic relay. So, and then they're all being processed in the same way. So the idea here is that you could have a motor command that's being generated by the motor system. You can have a motor command being generated by some other cortex or being detected by the sensory. There's different ways the brain can know how the eyes are moving or about to move. But in all cases, they go through these thalamic relay cells. So my point of pointing this out is that's true for these. I believe it's true for these relay cells as well, that it's not just this cell that's coming down into it now. It's also getting input from the motor system, which is also going to the high order thalamic relay. So there's an internally generated motor command, or there's one that's coming from the motor system itself, all being passed through separate relay cells, all being converted through this feedback from the cortex. This does not explain a little bit of a mystery. Is there a sensory feature being passed through the thalamus here, the high order thalamus? Like, remember, if I detect an edge in my retina, that's going to go through this first order thalamus. It's not a clear pathway for how that would get down to here and back up. And so it's possible that maybe just the motor command has to be transferred through this, and that the direct connections are representing features. Like this detected handle, and this is the coffee cup, that goes directly, but maybe instead of the motor behavior, which represents some orientation. I don't really understand it at all. At times I think I have more clarity on it, but sometimes I don't. So this is the complex diagram that we think about when we think about hierarchy in the cortex from an anatomy and functional point of view. I think from a Monty perspective, we can walk away with a couple things. Is that every region, every learning module has to be processing sensory data and motor data. The motor data could come from different sources, whether it's coming from a motor system or from a sensory system or some internal generated motor behavior. Like this cell here could be telling this region what it's planning on moving. So that's something that has to occur, and that there's clearly some sort of transform that is going on between a learning module, and especially in this case, we can say the learning module is doing some sort of transform on the sensation and the movement command, and it's doing them separately, meaning they're separate cells, even though they're all getting the same command. It'd be like saying, I'm going to change the orientation of the movement, and I'm going to change the orientation of my sensation, and something like that. So we have to be just aware of that. And when we think about hierarchy, there is a mystery we have to really resolve, which is how does motor behavior operate in a hierarchy? And maybe some of you guys already thought about that a bit, but that is not clear to me. What's going on from here to here, and what's going on from here to here. How's that from a hierarchical point of view makes sense?
I think the other one, the one that says we're about to move, is pretty critical, because that allows you to predict what you're going to see, and
right.
then go on from there.
Right, and that's how I think everyone viewed that. It was a fairly 5 years ago sort of epiphany on my part that the retina itself is also telling you how it actually is moving, which is not as good for the reason you just pointed out. It's like that's after the fact, right? The retina says, hey, I've moved, as opposed to this guy can tell you you're about to move. So as you point out, this one you can predict on. This one is like, whoops, you moved. And I think that the reason this is ground truth. The eye can tell you actually how it's actually moving. And these cells here, which actually may be moving the eye, and they're projecting up to this region of the cortex. How is this region of the cortex supposed to know how to interpret these movements? It's just a bunch of fibers coming in. And by the way, all these things change over your lifetime, right? All these things are learning or changing and modifying and so on. So there isn't like a genetically determined motor plan that says these cells mean X, Y, and Z. This region is getting these motor signals, but it doesn't know how to interpret them necessarily. So I think what's going on is that the input from the retina, it says, oh, the retina has just moved. It's moving at a speed of this speed to the right. that can now, that's being projected up here, as well as the actual motor signal that was generating is being projected up here. And now you have a training signal, so the cortex can say, oh, I know how to interpret this signal now. This is the ground truth. This is the thing that generated the ground truth. Now I can learn how to interpret this signal coming from here. And I'm pretty certain that's what's going on. And I bet you if we might even be able to find some papers hidden down in the archives of who knows where that could talk about the physiology of the cells and how they might do that. But that's how I think it's going on. So this is the one we like.
Is that motor output going to the next higher order area, or does it go back into the same region that generated it?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question. That's probably available someplace. So like the question is, here you've got these cells that are. This is not just a blob of cells in the supercilica. It also has a laminar structure, and it has different parts projected different parts of the cortex. So I was under the impression, but I might have made it up, that it just projects back to here, but it's possible it could project forward as well. Totally could. Yeah.
How's that synchronized? Like it's a sequential, parallel?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, the classic view is that it's all sequential. Like information comes in here, and it goes to here, then it goes to here, then it goes to here, then it goes to here. But there's some real holes in that. First of all, not shown on this diagram, another confusion, is that some of the cells right from the retina go right to the higher order. They go right to here. They skip, or either they go to both, maybe, I don't know, but there are direct connections from the retina to here and direct connections from the retina to here, and maybe even here, like 3 or 4 regions in a row they connect to. So everything else is still right, but it's not like that they only get connections, the retina only projects to V1. That's not true. And then here's another thing. If they've shown that sometimes the response in this second blue region can occur before the response in the first blue region. That is, and they can even get that response sometimes, but when they freeze this one, so it can't operate. So that tells you that this view of like ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk is not true. It's going to go on in parallel here to some extent. Simultaneously, these upper regions can respond quicker than the lower regions under some conditions. And so that's another sort of thing we have to deal with. I mean, the 1,000 brain series does that pretty well. We say, hey, this blue region here can learn objects as well, but they're going to be larger scale. I mean, so for example, if I look at how much of the retina projects to a patch of V1, it's a small part of the retina, very small. If I look at how much of the retina projects to a patch of V2, it's bigger. So V2 will be looking at a bigger area of the retina, and V4 will be looking at a bigger area still. These all could be modeling similar objects, but at different scales, because this only can look at a tiny small part of the visual field, and this looks at a much larger part of the visual field. But still, there's these connections that are that go from here to here to here. They also don't show it, but there are also connections that go from here to here to here. There's backwards projections from V4 to V2 to V1. They tend to have a very particular connectivity to the up layer 1. It's sort of like the general belief is that when you project that down, it's biasing this guy saying you should be seeing X here. So this upper region says, given what I'm seeing, like a coffee cup, you should be seeing a handle, or you should be seeing the logo or something like that. But all these things can occur. It can be obviously a very small thing that can only be recognized down here. It could be something that can be recognized in multiple regions at once. It could be flowing from here to here, but sometimes these guys respond before this guy does. For example, if I was looking at a fairly large object, let's say a big picture of a coffee cup, V1 may not really have much to help me with because it can only see fine detail. And so the fine detail is not very helpful when you're dealing with a bigger object. So, object recognition could occur here primarily.
You mentioned that those direct connections between the cortical regions might be boding, but would that actually make sense for different hierarchical regions to vote, or would it make more sense?
It could be because,
region?
okay, so I can bring up another paper, which I can't bring it up right this moment. That shows there are multiple sort of cell populations that seem to be projecting forward and backwards. And voting could make sense. For example, what if I was looking at an object that was recognizable by V1 and recognizable by V2, because it was small enough that I could recognize here, but it's not. There's no cutoff between the two. So and it's large enough that they can recognize here. Well, then they could vote. And so there are connections which seem to be not shown here. Connections that go from like layer 2 to layer 2 and layer 3 to layer 3 that could vote. And that would make sense if they're perceiving the same object, which often they are. All right, if there's only one thing to look at, that's what they're going to be perceiving if they can do it. There are other connections between these which are more of the hierarchical form. So layer 3 cells that project to layer 4. That was in the Feldman Van Esten paper. So there you get, that's a hierarchical connection, layer 3 to layer 4. Whereas before I was saying layer 2 to layer 2 is not a hierarchical connection. So layer 2 to layer 2 could be voting, and layer 3 to layer 4 would be more like, hey, this is the logo on the coffee cup, more of a feature type of thing. So unfortunately for us, all these things can seem to be occurring at once, or have combinations that can occur. The way I try to get past this morass, because it's daunting, is to focus on theory of what I know a region has to do, what a learning module has to do to learn a module, and really trying to understand this really clearly, and then tiptoe my way into saying, okay, well, how would I then explain the layer 2 to layer 2 connections? Well, that could be explained by voting. How would I explain the layer 3 to layer 4 connections? Well, that could be explained by hierarchical composition, that kind of thing. But always start with like, oh, objects, you know, I have to be able to learn objects, I have to learn the behaviors, I have to learn their composition, that kind of stuff. So I didn't promise this would be concise or easy, but
you know, this figure is actually really nice. I feel like there's nothing in there that like completely contradicts what we're doing right now, and yeah, it's a really nice overview.
yeah. I didn't talk about the physiology too much here, but it's worth mentioning because I think just to reiterate, you know, when you probe cells as you go up in the hierarchy here, you find cells that respond to more and more conceptual objects. You know, they don't find cells that respond to coffee cups down here. They only find cells that respond to edges, but they might find a cell somewhere 4 levels up in the hierarchy to find a coffee cups. Also, whatever you detect here, this is going to be on a very local area of the retina. And what you detect here tends to be over much larger areas of the retina. Now, this could argue, you might argue against the thousand brain theory, but the thousand brain theory says, well, what this lower region is recognizing is not an edge at some location on the retina. It's doing sensory motor integration. So it's tracking the movement of the retina over time, and because it can track it over time, it can learn an object representation down here composed of edges at different locations. And the way they do the physiology and test these cells, they would never see that. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't. I can explain why, but they wouldn't see that. They would just miss it completely. And when they look at the cells in these regions, they can only make sense of about 40% of them. About 60% of the cells, they have no clue to what they're doing. They just don't. They can't get them to respond in a way that makes sense to them, so they just ignore them. So it's very clear to me that even a low-level region like this could be learning a more complex object. The reason you might find like a face cell or a cup cell or something like that in a higher region, I believe, is what's going on is that the output of the lower region is already recognized an object like a cup. And that is now the input to the next region. It's not that the next region is recognizing the cup. The next input is getting an input, which is a cup. And so they say, hey, look, there's cup cells up here. Yeah, that's because I've already recognized a cup down in the lower region. So like you wouldn't find a cup cell here. You'd find a sparse distributed representation in this D1 that represents cups, but you wouldn't find a single cell that seems to be a cup. but you could look at a sparse pattern and you could decode it as cup. Whereas once you start moving, then you take that sparse distributed representation and you feed into layer 4 here, then you start getting representations of things like cells that do represent cups because the spatial fluid turns them into that. So there's a lot of physiology where people would argue like, oh no, V1 could never recognize an object. We don't see any cells that do anything like that. And it's because they don't know how to look for them. They're missing it. I don't know what got me on this, but there's a lot of physiology. As you go up here, you do find to get more and more complex objects over larger and larger parts of the receptive field. But none of that's inconsistent with what we're doing or the thousand brains theory, as far as I'm concerned. This is maybe a good point to stop. I don't have any more information.
Sorry if you already went over this, but I'm just curious about that motor output box. Is there also hierarchy in that box, or is it sort of like there's a whole bunch of stuff, a many-to-one mapping to this one motor output region?
I don't know if there's any hierarchy. I think like if you look at the superior colliculus, this is the one I've read the most papers on. It has a very specific architecture. So there will be cells arrayed in a layer that represent how far the eye will move if you innervate that cell. Like if you innervate this cell, I might move 30 degrees in this direction. And if you innervate another cell further over, it might move 20 degrees in a certain direction, that kind of thing. So there's order to it. There's structure in it. There's layers in it. But I don't think the layers are hierarchical. I might be wrong about that. I'd have to check. But it's certainly nothing like the hierarchy you see in the cortex. It's a fairly small organ. There's equivalent ones again for different sensory modalities, but I don't believe there's like a clear hierarchical organization to it. Although there is a lot of organization. It's not like a blob of cells, and there are many papers on it. And I guess we could probably search pretty quickly and find out if there's any sort of hierarchical representation. I'm the impression that it's not the case, but
okay.
I don't know.
That's good to know. And then just a follow up to that, the eye is like a relatively simple thing to move. Do we know anything about how the structure of that motor box changes when it's like moving a multi-joint thing? Like
yeah. We in the Royal we do. Me as Jeff, no. I started reading this book that Vernon Mountcastle wrote about the hand. I started reading that yesterday. It's a big book, like 1,000 pages. And I was searching through it for information on that very topic, that very question. And it's really complicated, and I gave up and my arm was hurting. And so I just stopped. So there are answers to that. If we want to know, we can dig in and we'll be able to find lots of papers that talk about what happens in the somatosensory system when these layer 5 cells project down to some part of the spinal cord or whatever. What happens there? But I don't know the answer to that question. It's a really good question. Obviously, the eyes all move at once, right? You can't move part of the eye, you got 2 eyes, so you can move them somewhat separately, but you can't move part of the retina separate from the other part, where you can do that with your fingers. So that's a good observation and something we have to be aware of. That's what I always think of it as like, this guy is basically trying, a layer 5 cell is trying to say, here's how I want my patch to move. It doesn't know about anybody else's. It's just saying, my input, this is how I want my input to move.
Yeah, but I guess from a computational point of view, I guess you could argue it's hierarchical. Like, I think there's evidence that, like, yeah, if you stimulate a certain part of motor cortex, you can initiate like a complex movement, which seems to be like, yeah, I guess a series of simpler movements. And if you stimulate a different part, you might just get a simple movement.
Right.
But
I
don't know how that maps onto anatomy or
Right. I think you're right. I bet you I think you're making the theoretical argument that if you look at especially like the somatomotor system where your fingers can move independently, that there has to be some sort of hierarchical representation that's subcortical. I think that's what.
Yeah, like I think there's. I mean, I definitely don't know the papers, but like I think there's studies showing that if you stimulate a particular part of a monkey's brain, it will like kind of make like a gravity motion. Whereas if you stimulate a different part, you'll just get a finger that twitches.
Right.
And you can seem to kind of be able to break that down into like a hierarchy of complexity.
Yeah. And there's another part of the brain called the cerebellum, which has actually got the most cells of most neurons of the entire brain. It's not as big as the cortex, but it has more cells in it. And the cerebellum, one of the things it does is it's related to these fine motor commands. And so it has a lot to do with executing fine motor skills. And if you lose your cerebellum or it's damaged, you end up losing a lot of fine motor skills. You know, things get awkward and jerky. And so there's a complex, I think maybe Neil's point is that there's a very complex motor system that underlies the somatosensory system. That is certainly true, whereas it doesn't appear to be as complex underlying the visual motor system. That, you know, it's pretty, the superior colliculus, if I recall, is pretty direct control of the muscles of the eye. So it's a simpler system.
Which I guess is nice for us from the point of view of Monty, that like we don't need to worry too much about, yeah, kind of because of the simplicity of, I guess, the camera moving or whatever. We just need to be like, okay, camera move here. We don't need to have like a complex path planning algorithm or something. You know?
Right, like, yeah, how do I move my head and my body and my torso and my legs to move the eye over there? We can just say move the eye a little bit here or there.
Yeah.
One more question about the motor box. So, and sorry if you guys have already thought about this, because
No reason to apologize.
But so we have like 3 pieces of cortex in blue here, and each one of those with that motor output is saying, I want to move my patch of the retina here. So what if there's conflicting motor outputs? How do different motor signals from the cortex get resolved by that motor output box?
I have no idea, and I have no idea unless someone else does. This gets back to the question of hierarchy. Is there a hierarchical preference for these? Right? Is somebody more important than somebody else? Do they work together? You know, I'm sure there's papers on that question. I say that because I don't want to just volunteer like, oh, I'll go look them up, because to me, this is a really slow process. It takes forever to look these things up. But we could do it if it's important. If we get down to the point, like we really need to know what's going on in the brain of this thing, we can dig into that. And I'm almost certain that we'd find some papers that describe those questions. Yeah. So I don't know how they coordinate, right? Yeah. What if one region says move this way and the other region says move that way? What happens? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even the higher regions, they don't even have like a sensor patch directly associated with it, because they just get input from lower regions, and that doesn't necessarily have to be like this patch of skin shouldn't appear now.
Yeah. It's not clear to me, by the way, okay, so Sherman said every region has these layer 5 cells project subcortically someplace motor. Oh, now it's coming back to me a bit. Oh, it's coming back. In many regions, that projection could be to the basal ganglia, which is a set of regions, a set of subcortical functions that are really complex, and that probably has hierarchical organization to it, and that they generate all kinds of behaviors and effective behaviors and so on. So it's not going to be simple like, oh, here's an output and move a muscle. It's going to be, it could be like, I have a desired movement of some sort, but it could be telling a very complex subcortical system that might have a whole bunch of sub behaviors and so on to it. The visual system is the simplest one in that regard.
Thanks.
Oh, I should tell you one other thing that's interesting about this. Remember I said that there were 2 sources of movement behavior for the visual system. One's coming from the eyes and one's coming from superior colliculus. There's actually a 3rd source I forgot to mention, which is coming from your inner ear, the what do you call it, system? Come on, circles, the little balance system, what's it called?
Yeah, like the semicircular canals.
Yeah, what's the name of that? What's the name of that sensory system? It has a name.
Cochlea?
No, it's yeah, God, what's it called?
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian, like
It's not the proprioceptive
yeah,
system.
vestibular.
Vestibular. I was going to say it begins with a V. I knew it began with a V. Yeah, vestibular system. So the vestibular system is also projects to these thalamic relays, because the vestibular system is also a movement command. Vestibular system will tell you how your head is moving, and so that also feeds into these thalamic relay cells. It's kind of crazy, but we don't have to deal with all that complexity. We can take a very simple system that has a simple movement, and try to get it to work. All right, I keep yabbering on here. Any other questions?
No, yeah.
All right, that was a complex way to get started. I'll stop sharing my screen.
That was definitely useful.
Lots of food for thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we have to like pretend we didn't know all that and just go back and say, okay, what are we going to do for money?
No, I feel like that actually fit pretty well about how I've been thinking about Monty and how we might add hierarchy. So yeah, I think it was actually really nice to see that.
Are you going to continue on today with some of your questions? What's your plan?
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe we could just yeah, I made a slide with kind of open questions that we have, and maybe we could just go through them and see if there are some other questions that you guys have. So we just have a framework of what all we need to answer in the next week. Yeah, so basically everything on the bottom part of this diagram we have kind of implemented, and now the main part that we need to resolve is the connectivity to the next layer and what's actually happening in the models of the higher level learning modules. And yeah, I can just go through these questions that I came up with so far, and then we can like see if there are any other questions. So I think one main question we just kind of need to answer is, what problems do we want to solve with hierarchy? Because that will just inform everything else. And then how should we implement hierarchy, which would include what's the communication protocol? So what's the input and output format of lower level learning modules to higher level learning modules? What's the connectivity? So does one learning module connect to one other learning module, or is there more like a many-to-one or many-to-many connectivity, and then some kind of pooling going on? And then related to that would be, what's the information routing? Is there like some kind of attention mechanism or something in this direction to decide which information gets routed to what higher level learning module? And then, yeah, related, I guess, to your question, Lewis, like, what's the temporal sequence of this information processing? Do we like update the lower level learning modules and then send it to the next one and then update those, or does everything like happen at once and then the higher level learning modules just take like several steps until information reaches them if they don't have the skip connection, for example? And then how do we represent object ID to higher level learning modules? That's a bit related to what we talked about before, with maybe creating an SDR representation of the object ID that expresses something like similarity between different objects. And then, yeah, which models are learned at what level? So does the lower level of the hierarchy learn more the like little detailed models, or does it learn like very coarse models that then get composed together in the higher levels of the hierarchy? So like this kind of question of propositional versus decompositional or associative hierarchy. And then, yeah, related to that, do we supervise this process somehow? Like, how do we tell the system actually which learning module is supposed to learn what? Like, we just see input, how do we tell a learning module, yeah, you're a lower level learning module, you should learn this basic shape. And you're a higher level learning module, you should learn like the composition of those shapes. Does this happen naturally, or do we have to kind of have some supervisory signal or like learning speed parameter or something like that? Yeah, so that's kind of the questions that are on my mind.
Can I just ask one question? Is hierarchy the right representation? Because we're skipping layers, we went back and forth.
Yeah.
What does level mean?
Yeah, that's another good question. So yeah, actually, I kind of actually like to most this associative hierarchy idea of like you just kind of associate information between different learning modules, so it's not necessarily like one level.
It's not like
level,
what you,
next
it's not
level,
like
but
with the previous slide. And you say the previous slide I have a hierarchy.
yeah, so like that it wouldn't be like as clear cut as here where you have one level and then the next level, but more like some learning modules associate their input with others. So there might be like one of those on the top row might get input from a sensor actually.
So what does it mean to be a hierarchy?
Yeah.
I think that was one question.
I think partly this will come from like, what do we want the different, how do we expect models to be represented in different parts? Because I think partly it comes from language that you implicitly have an understanding of hierarchy when you think about an object. And so that's kind of what we're mapping onto, or trying to map onto this, that we might expect more, for example, maybe a more complex object is represented at a higher level of hierarchy that may receive sensory inputs at the same time as, but at least from the point of view of like representational complexity, it might be higher up in hierarchy, even though that doesn't map on exactly to neural processing.
No, what does it mean for that communication protocol, for example?
So yeah, so then I guess that could be separate, like what is the communication protocol that needs to exist to solve those kind of hierarchical representations? Maybe a very parallel kind of one that's not following a strict hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's going to be kind of like this Thalamic von Essen diagram where there's
Right.
like the hierarchy is kind of artificially introduced by saying, oh yeah, these had a lot of stages before, but actually there are also connections that go almost directly from one of the first layers there. So like, I think actually, if I remember right in their paper, there were like a lot of different options how you could have ordered these regions in the diagram, and this was.
But yeah, I mean, it's not maybe a crazy thought to be like, yeah, is it better to say like, what problems do we want to solve with multi-level processing rather than what problems do we want to solve with hierarchy? Because yeah, I guess hierarchy is a very loaded term.
That's true, yeah.
And like, we definitely want recurrence. So maybe by thinking about it more as like, yeah, multi-level processing that kind of acknowledges the fact that it's not easily separated.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I haven't been able to hear everything, but the associative hierarchy, I think you're saying it really isn't a hierarchy. It's like two regions that are associated with the other. Isn't it just like voting? It's like I could have a learning module that's getting vision and other learning modules getting touch, and they would be voting to each other and trying to agree on what they're doing, or two vision modules next to each other. Is that what associative meant in that case?
So I see it a bit. So the voting to me is more like learning modules that have models of the same object talk with each other about like if it is this object. They both know about, I don't know, a pencil. But then in hierarchy it would be more like the module that gets input as a compositional model of like the output from the lower object. So it doesn't have also the model of the pen, but it has like a model of, I don't know.
So how's that? So that sounds like compositional. So what's associative then? That sounds like a compositional.
It's more like a soft version of it where there are like a lot of skip connections, and it's not really clear that something on level 5 of the hierarchy has gone through like 5 learning modules before it arrived there, but it might
Yeah.
have just gone through 1 and then.
But you're still talking about compositional structure, right?
I think for me, at least, sometimes I think about, or like, I feel like compositional is more like statistically regular associations. I appreciate I'm using the word associative again, but whereas kind of instantaneous few shot stuff is more associative. So I feel like a logo on a coffee cup would be a more associative representation, whereas a handle to a coffee cup is a more compositional one.
What I'm missing it. Why is that? It seems like the handle and the logo are similar to my mind. I mean, it's not
Say
like,
that well, what's similar?
well, I mean, not all coffee cups have a logo, so
Yeah.
maybe it's statistically more likely to have a handle. But other than that, there's some substructure that's at some location on a larger structure. So I don't see the
I guess
difference.
I feel like compositional objects are so like we keep seeing this thing that's like a cup with a handle, and so we develop a compositional representation for coffee cup, whereas I guess a more kind of rapid binding kind of representation would be, oh, this is a Numenta coffee cup.
So
I don't know.
It's basically just incorporating like frequency information. Like when I see something that looks like a coffee cup, just with high probability, I expect there to be a handle. But I can't say with high probability there's going to be a mental logo, because there can be some other logo or maybe logo.
Right, but that's all just the probabilities, right? I could live in a world where there's more logos and less handles. There doesn't seem anything fundamentally different about the two problems, just the statistical regularity of them.
I guess I feel one more defines the object identity. One is more an association. Like, I guess maybe a better example would be like a cat's face. Like a cat's face has ears. Sure, there are cats that don't have ears, but you know, if it's been removed or whatever. But the presence of the ears kind of informs the identity of cat's face. So that's compositional, I feel. Whereas associative is like, oh, this cat is wearing a hat. Like it happens to be associated at this point in time.
Yeah.
But it's not like hats have anything to do with informing the identity of cats.
And I feel like it's still the same process, it's just on a different
I think
time scale.
for sure. I think it might be a similar.
Like short-term memory.
Yeah,
thing.
right.
For sure, I think it might be a similar process, but at least I feel like that's maybe, at least, yeah. I don't know.
There could be cats that just happen to have hats all the time, and that's basically yeah.
But then we'd probably find a name for that, like horses that always have
Right.
wings. I call them
Right,
Pegasus.
Right,
Like,
right.
and then you
I know.
develop like a new.
I guess I see that. I
Yeah.
see it on it's like a spectrum, right? It's a
Yeah.
spectrum of probabilities, but
Yeah, I appreciate it's
so-
not like completely separate.
so
thing.
then I would rather, then I'd rather treat it that way as opposed to something totally unique. But what is decompositional hierarchy? I'm not sure. I don't understand what that is. What's that word mean?
Yeah, basically the idea would be at the lowest level of the hierarchy, you have basic shapes like cylindrical shape, and then higher levels of the hierarchy basically specify details at different locations on this object. So it's kind of just, the difference is just where in the hierarchy is what stores.
Okay. I never thought of that as a possibility. Is that a real possibility, or are you just throwing it in there for completeness?
Yeah, basically like in this terrible drawing, it's like a tree on the one side, and then on each location we have features associated with it, like the color or like the structure of the leaf or the tree trunk or something. And the difference between compositional or decompositional would be whether the left side is the top level LM or the right side is the top level LM.
Is there any thoughts at all that the right side could be the top level? I mean,
I feel like so this doesn't answer this, but I was just gonna say, yeah, I think it'd be really cool if we could get both, because from what we've discussed about this decompositional one, it has some issues. I feel like the example you gave, which was a nice one, was like a blurry photo of a tree. You don't recognize leaves or anything like that. The features are extremely impoverished. but you still recognize it as a tree. So it's kind of almost like the Gestalt like way of representing something, where you first just get like a coarse shape, and then you then kind of get more detail. And yeah, maybe this whole like, oh, this sometimes the higher level of the anatomy is responding, quote unquote, higher level of the anatomy is responding before. Like maybe that's because both of these things are kind of happening in parallel, and the whole thing is kind of.
Yeah, it strikes me, well, the evidence would be, there's a lot of evidence suggesting very strongly that if you go higher in the hierarchy, you're going to get these more complex, bigger objects. And but you can do decomposition by flowing down the hierarchy.
Yeah, it could be represented. Yeah.
To me, that's to where the decomposition goes. I could have something at the highest level and say, look, I don't have the details, but I'm going to predict them and try to look for them. But I view that as just two different directions of flow on a hierarchical structure. You know, going up and going
Yes, basically,
down.
like it might still be IT cortex rather than V1 that's representing this coarse tree model, but then there's just a lot of information flow, which is kind of doing the decompositional hierarchy you're talking about. But anatomically, it just happens to be starting at the top of the book.
Right.
Yeah,
So
I think like this associative hierarchy idea, or like just multiprocessing of input is kind of a good way to think about it. That you don't necessarily need to recognize all the leaves before you can recognize the tree, but you can get like, for example, you could also just get like a skip connection input to V2 or V4 with a large receptive field to like recognize the coarse outline of the tree. But then whatever the detailed features on the tree are doesn't matter too much. It could be like tree with snow on it.
Well, but it should go both ways, right? I mean, imagine I have very simple. Let's say I have two levels. The first level recognizes leaves. The second level recognizes trees. So if I see leaves, I can sort of suggest there should be a tree, and if I see a tree, I can project backwards and suggest there should be leaves. It just seems like the same structure in the hierarchy could do both. Am I missing something there?
I've tried drawing like some early drawings to try and think about where the analogy breaks, or like where it's less clear how these two would kind of, like there's some things where it feels like you can kind of lay out the decompositional and the compositional and kind of like they just sort of work together, and like you say, Jeff, it's just like information flowing the other way. And then there's some examples of like representations that we think might appear in a certain type of this processing where it's not obvious. And in general, I think it's in the middle. They seem kind of to easily mesh, but then it's at the extremes where you have like, either like very coarse shapes versus like very detailed features. Like how do those fit into the two?
Right.
But yeah, so maybe kind of having some drawings.
Well, as I was suggesting earlier, the anatomy suggests that when you go from V1 to V2 or V2 back to V1, there are connections that are really associative, meaning voting-like connections, or just, and then there's others that are like really hierarchical. And we know that a high-level object could be learned in, you could learn a copy coupling both of those. So it seems like there has to be a way of in the brain, at least, that these learning modules can flow seamlessly between these extremes of of size and whether they're representing the same thing or compositional things. It's not obvious, but okay, I get, at least you answered my question. I know what you meant by it, by what you meant by decompositional.
Yeah, I think yes, maybe in some session we just like draw some more. I think once we decide on some of the earlier questions, like the communication protocol and stuff, maybe it will already be clear. Like, I feel like all three of those can become equivalent very easily. It's just a question of perspective in some sense, especially if we're saying we don't have this strict sequential processing of one level of hierarchy and then the next and then the next.
Yeah, to be honest, in my humble take on this is that honestly, the compositional, decompositional, and associative, all of those things just associate with my definition of compositional. So like that's what I keep hearing. So like I think maybe it might be simpler to tame this beast by just thinking about compositionality and then different types of connections, like from higher levels back to lower levels or lateral connections. But that's just my take.
Right.
or different timescales like we discussed earlier, but frankly, everything still kind of seems fundamentally compositional as far as I can see.
Yeah, yeah, so back to the questions. Are there any other questions you would add in here? Like anything you feel like that should
Maybe.
have a lot more
I
attention?
don't know if we'll have time, but how do we represent object ID to higher level knowledge? Related to this is also like, how do we learn that representation? So that was something we
Yeah.
talked about that one point, like, but if we are going to, for example, use it SDRs, then that raises questions about exactly how we learn those SDRs. There's like a couple different things, but that could be like a sub point, maybe.
So the algorithm object.
But how do we learn those? So like, I feel like it's like a sub question that could lead to a lot of different possibilities. Like we might agree on how we want to represent it, but still be unsure about how the best way to achieve those representations is.
Basically, it's like inference time versus learning time.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you want to try to list out what the different types of problems you might want to solve with a hierarchy? seems like-
Yes, the first question basically.
Yeah, I can only think of one that like, so I'm a bit curious what the other ones are.
Yeah, so I have always a few slides of my own stabs at these questions, but yeah, one would be the fast association that Niels was talking about, like the logo on the cup, and without requiring to relearn the whole coffee cup or the whole logo to be able to quickly associate this. And then second would be representing like higher level object part relationships, like letters. You still have those 3 bars, but they can be further away or longer or shorter or tilted or something. And then
Yeah,
you
which is
will
kind of a form of robustness.
yeah,
To kind of invariance, like
yeah,
you
exactly.
respond regardless of the particular H. You recognize that as a H or whatever,
Yeah,
or Korean character type.
yeah,
Do
yeah,
you see those as fundamentally different or as sort of on a spectrum?
yeah. No, they're definitely related, I would say. Yeah, again, probably just on a different time scale.
I wouldn't, yeah, just to play devil's advocate, I feel like it could be that there is something different. Just looking at the evidence from psychology, like there is, I feel a fair amount of evidence that fast association is a very serial process that people do well only if you can, what you call it, devote attention to it. Whereas these kinds of more familiar associations that you've kind of been exposed to many times can be processed in parallel and without the need for attention. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely different processes. Like maybe it's just like attention is kind of helping or something like that. But I do feel like there's some evidence that there is still a difference there.
Yeah, it's kind of like, of course, it reminds me of the very fast memory that you can form in the hippocampus versus slow memories it takes from the
Right.
cortex. But you know, there's the thing about what it takes to recognize an object. There's the graph, which is like, oh, these are the features at these locations. But that is on itself is not that is not a momentary representation of the object. I can't say what's the name of that object. It's like I can say, yeah, I know all these pieces are in this arrangement, but I don't have a singular name for them. Like I can't. If you ask me to identify it, how to describe it? It'd be like you could learn a melody without having a name for the melody, or you could learn an arrangement of furniture in a room without having a name for that type of room. And so this is what the temporal pooler did. It essentially says, oh, we take all these different points on the graph and we can associate them with a common representation, a common ID. And now therefore I can say, well, if I know what graph I'm on, then I can know what the ID is, and I have a label for it. The problem with that is that it takes a lot of memory to do that. The temporal pooler requires pooling of a whole bunch of unique patterns onto changing patterns onto a single pattern. It takes a lot of memory to do that. It's not easy. So I always felt like, so this idea of like a fast I think it's really easy to learn a new graph. It's like, oh, these are things arranged relative to each other. Just add them onto the graph really quickly. But learning the temporal pooling name of a thing could take a lot longer. And I'm wondering if it's just really that's the only distinction you're making there is that, you know, we don't come up with labels for everything we learn. It's just too expensive. But we can learn the relationships between lots and lots of things without having a label on them. Does that sound like it's the same thing you were just talking about?
I guess, yeah, it's maybe related but like, yeah, it's more kind of like how you, regardless of kind of whether you have a name for something, I guess it's kind of like how do you basically identify something, and when those features that the compositional features that define it, if those are kind of statistically regular, something you've seen many times, versus something that you've only seen for like.
Okay, well that seems to go back. That seems to go back to this issue in the brain where we've got these inactive synapses in the hippocampus, where you can learn something really rapidly, right, instantaneously. Where in most of the brain you can't do that. You have to be exposed to it over and over and over again so the synapses grow. That seems like it's related to that difference.
Yeah, so I guess then the question is like how you can use those representations. So just for example, like if you ask people like a search task where basically you have a bunch of objects on the screen and you ask people to identify a particular object. So for example, you have a bunch of objects on the screen and you say, okay, tell me, is X object somewhere here?
Yeah.
And so you might have, let's say, a bunch of letters. And so you have a bunch of A letters and a bunch of B letters. But in this case, you have a bunch of B letters and you have one A. Okay, is the letter A here? Sometimes the A isn't there. And then so how quickly do people respond to that? And how quickly is people's response a function of the number of distractors, the number of like letters in this case? And if you, for example, if it's, let's say it's just a diagonal bar and vertical bars, but you're looking for like a diagonal bar that's green, and there's vertical and diagonal bars that are either red or green, but there's one that's diagonal and green. Finding that, looking through all the objects, seems to require you basically looking through every object until you find it. Whereas looking for T's versus L's, and this is even the case if they're slightly skewed, you can do like almost instantaneously.
Yeah. So how's that relate to hierarchy here? I'm confused by that.
So because a T or an L is a compositional object formed from vertical and horizontal bar. And you could argue that a diagonal line or a vertical line or whatever it happens to be, that's the color green, is also a compositional object. But one, the T and the L, are kind of defined by their statistically regular associations. The other one, you've just decided to associate green with vertical feature and said, okay, this is the object that we're looking for. And so that's the one I'm saying that's more the fast associative one, and the one that we seem to have more of a bottleneck in terms of how we can process it.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess also related to the labeling that you described, I think it's maybe whether so the first bullet point here is kind of, you just have a also association that you haven't learned like an object category itself yet. So for the letters, you have learned the category for the L or the T itself, and it's like its own model of the object, but the fast association is not yet its own model. It's just, I detect these two things together. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it may be that as you develop like a more like a different representation, whatever the form of that is, that captures the kind of regularity, then you also form an IAD label, or as you were saying, Jeff, like you could form the label and then later you could be told, okay, this name of the song is, but I feel like that's more like a language thing, that like, yeah, do you have a name for a particular thing?
Yeah,
I don't think
like if you have the same name for different instances, then you have to like learn a category for it. Like if you call multiple things a cup, that look slightly different, you have to learn like a model that incorporates those differences.
Yeah, but I guess like if you're doing the search paradigm and you say, okay, a green vertical bar is called a omnom, like it doesn't help. It doesn't make people faster to say, oh, okay, that's what an omnom is, like, or whatever.
But could you, if you did this exercise over and over again, would you get really good at it? It's like-
Yes, so that's so it used to be this dogma that, oh, it's something special, magical about color, and this was like the research from Anne Friesman and stuff, that like color has to be bound with shape or whatever. But like there's evidence that, for example, a yellow banana is you're quicker to identify than a blue banana, for example. So where there's kind of regularity in that association, then yeah, you are quicker at identifying. So it's it's likely on a spectrum. It's unlikely to be kind of a hard.
It sounds like the trend is basically the speed of inference is related to the frequency with which you
familiarity.
observe
Yeah,
things.
and also like if you take the T and the L and you rotate them more, so you make them less familiar in terms of the structure they're used to. Again, you become slower.
So it's just check that's.
Yeah, so I think in terms of Monty, we want to focus on like mostly the second part and learning compositional models, and then this fast associative property comes out naturally because we will recognize the logo and the cup, and we'll just have both as output from some columns. And then our learning paradigm could incorporate that if we see an association of these things often enough to build a new model of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can recognize this new model of the Numenta cup. for
Yeah.
example.
I think, if I understood what you said, I think I agree with that. Yeah.
I think there's it's been a while since I worked with you guys, but I think there was also something going on where there was like a ranking of the most likely objects based on the sensory input or so. It sounds like that might come into play here too, because like you might just start your guess saying, okay, well, it could be all of these objects, but my guess is it's the most likely one. And if that turns out to be right, then like you kind of have it instantly. But if you have to like search around a lot and then like reshuffle the order of those objects, possibly bring something that's not likely into the queue of like the K most likely, it seems like that would take longer. So I'm wondering if this phenomenon is already kind of available for your implementation.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, if we don't have a model of like the logo plus coffee cup yet, then we would kind of switch the most likely hypothesis between the two at the moment, where we would have multiple learning modules that see, one sees the logo and one sees the cup. They would have two different most likely hypotheses. But like the case that you kind of have like an underdog hypothesis coming up later on is, I guess, more if there's a lot of noise or if you switched from one object to another object during the episode.
Okay, so that's helpful, but maybe the more important question is like, is object frequency encoded in your implementation so far? Like if you have sensory input and you've seen like the mug 10 times as many times as you've seen the chair or whatever it is, like does the mug come up to the front of that queue faster?
Yeah, not yet. So right now we have like flat priors. So every object is equally likely at the beginning of an episode. I mean, we could have like a more default prior, like if you're in a kitchen, you assume more to see like kitchen associated items with. Yeah,
No, that helps explain why it makes sense why you have not incorporated that yet. Because it sounds like it would basically just be like based on the number of episodes. Like if I did 5 episodes with the mug and 1 episode with the chair, like only then would I care that the mug is more likely.
Yeah.
And it's completely up to you. And so it's just sort of an empiric exercise right now.
Yeah, I think with the current setup, it wouldn't help because we just test all objects equally. But yeah, later on, I guess it could make sense to have something like that.
Yeah. So let's set a context. Well,
Yeah, to kind of have some context that gives you a prior of what you're expecting to see.
Bases
Basically,
in light plug outlets or whatever.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so coming back to this question, for the problems that we like to solve, would you all agree that like kind of those 3 things are like problems we want to solve, like compositionality, which is then like object categories, and related to that to just be able to model structurally complex objects in a more efficient way. Like we could have a model of a complex airplane in one module, but it would require tons of data points, and it wouldn't be so robust as if we have like the different parts of an airplane in separate models, and then we can compose them together in like the overall airplane model.
Yeah, I think computational efficiency is definitely a big one as well. In terms of just this, like, it's not clear to me, kind of like, so that there's the top 2 bullet points, and then there's the next 3 bullet points.
Yeah,
so like in terms of, if we're going away with like a short list of like what the problems we want to solve are.
yeah, so I guess first 2 are more like examples, and then those 3 are like the general capabilities. But yeah, it's not very clear, I guess.
No, it's, yeah.
First 2 would be both related to categories and compositionality. And then the efficient way is just some practical reason.
Okay, yeah.
This might be off in the woods a little bit, but like one question I have is like, is maybe the notion of object state only exists for like certain objects? So like a door with a handle that can spin and then open, like those are actions that you can apply to a door. It changes the state of the door. But maybe these lower level modules are only seeing like small parts of the door. And so when you make a change to the object state, the lower level modules don't know what they're going to see, but the higher level modules that have the notion of like the door and the handle simultaneously.
Well, that might be true, but I would rather, my first take on that would be not to do it that way. My first take on that would be say, how can a single learning module solve that problem? Even if it can't do it for a very complex or structurally complex object. But you remember, well, again, I've always resisted trying to use hierarchy to solve fundamental problems that have to occur everywhere. I know, I guess I'm throwing out my bias on that one. My bias to say, ask, could we solve that problem within a learning module itself? You know,
That's well received.
yeah. And maybe we can't, but it's, at first blush, I would say it's not obvious you can't do that yet. You know?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like object states we don't really deal with yet at all. So I guess that'll be something we add on later. But then I think you're right, like if it's some like a large object, we need to recognize like a more global state. It would be difficult to do with one learning module, or at least like with the 3rd point, it will just be very much more inefficient to do it with one learning module as opposed to using multiple modules.
Well, I think you're right. The structurally complex object is one that sort of suggests you need multiple modules. But the basics of behaviors, it's not clear to me. It's almost like behaviors are almost like object categories with, you know, behavioral linkages between them, you know.
Yeah, it touches on an interesting point that like if we do categories or we want to achieve categorization with hierarchy, the way we define categories is also not really clear. Like, right, so far we've kind of been thinking of it as morphological similarity, but it could also be like behavioral similarity, like it shares something you sit down on, but the morphology can be very, very different. So yeah, I guess we have to think about that as well.
But yeah, I feel like that could be like almost like a parallel classification system that we tack on later. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would also be related to like this maybe SDR representation of object ID.
Right.
Like what is the measure of similarity there?
Yeah. Yeah, just in terms of these problems, I feel like it would help me if we kind of wrote out in slightly more where it's like exactly what the kind of problem is.
Like an example problem, an example or more?
Or just like, for example, like, well, for example, object categories. So describing object categories as a problem. I don't know.
Okay,
guess-
that's too broad, you're saying. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or just like understanding like why is something a particular problem? Like, so for example, for me, like something that be clear to me is like, what do we want to solve? We want to solve, or like, what's the problem? Being able to robustly recognize compositional objects. So like, for example, like the letters. So it's a problem because, yeah, I guess they can vary. Yeah, and so then hierarchy might resolve that. And then object categories, I guess, like, how do we, I guess it's challenging to, how do you represent objects, object categories of different granularity? I don't know, like maybe it's pedantic, but at least I feel like I would have a clear sense of what I'm trying to achieve like later down the line. If
Yeah, I've always found it helpful, almost essential, to pick a problem, a specific problem that then you can answer those questions about. You can easily pick a bad problem, so that's a challenge there. But sometimes it's helpful just to have a very specific task involved. You know, I've used the logo on the coffee cup as one, but lots of them like that. That itself can help you enumerate what the specific details of this challenge is. So I'm just suggesting that.
yeah, I feel like that would help me as well, like a specific example for each one.
Yeah.
I think object categories is kind of something that comes out of compositionality and representing structurally complex objects in an efficient way. Because basically, an object category is a definition of a composition of features that is always the same, even if the features are variable. So like a cat is always like 2 eyes, 1 nose, and 2 ears. But the relative displacement between them can slightly vary, and the color of the eyes and ears and everything can be very different. So it's kind of like a set of similar compositional objects that we summarize it into a category.
But I guess this is what I feel like there's like multiple problems there potentially. Like there's the problem of like, yeah, how do you consistently recognize a cat despite like changes in displacement and stuff? And then how do you represent, there's like cat versus there's like tabby cat versus like tiger or whatever. Like, so I feel like both of those kind of, and so I guess I'm wondering is it would just be helpful to kind of explode these slightly to be in terms of like what the specific like potential problems are. Because I feel like they may have different solutions, like having invariance to the kind of features of a cat's face isn't necessarily can have the same solution through hierarchy as like how do you decide to represent different granularities of like cat labels.
Yeah, and I mean what you define as a category depends on your interaction with it as well. Like I don't speak Chinese, so I just represent all Chinese characters as one category, like this character is Chinese. But if I would be able to read Chinese, each of them would be its own category, basically. So it's kind of also a bit arbitrary of where we say this is category of this is not. I don't know, should we like just write down, make a new slide and write down someone?
We could write on the, yeah, maybe it's quicker to type actually. Writing on what was.
I think it's a great idea. I'd like to excuse myself right now.
Okay.
I'm a bit uncomfortable, and I also have to do something with my granddaughter, but I'll be there tomorrow.